She trusted him with her heart, but when she caught him cheating, everything changed. The betrayal cut deeper than anything she'd ever felt. But what she did next? It left him speechless. This is a story of revenge, power, and reclaiming her life after betrayal. You won't believe the twist. Stay tuned, and don't forget to subscribe for more shocking stories like this. Sophie had always believed in the idea of true love. She had met Mark 3 years ago, and from the start, their connection seemed magical. He was everything she had ever wanted: charming, thoughtful, and loving. Their relationship grew stronger with each passing month, and before long, they were planning their future together. They talked about getting married, starting a family, and growing old together. Sophie felt like the luckiest woman in the world. But something had changed in recent months. It was subtle at first. Mark would be more distant, spending late nights at work or ignoring her messages. Sophie noticed it, but she chalked it up to stress. Work was tough, and they were both juggling so many things. It was only natural that things would get a little strained. Sophie told herself not to worry, that it was just a phase. However, the unease inside her grew stronger. She began to wonder if something was wrong, if maybe the perfect life they had been building wasn't so perfect after all. One evening, after a long day at work, Sophie came home early to surprise Mark. She wanted to make dinner for him, maybe light some candles and have a cozy evening together. As she entered their apartment, she noticed Mark's coat was on the couch, but there was no sign of him. His phone was left on the kitchen counter, face down. Sophie felt an odd sense of discomfort creeping in. She didn't know why, but something about the scene didn't sit right with her. A few minutes later, Mark walked in, seemingly surprised to see her home so early. "Oh, hey, I didn't know you'd be back," he said, a little too casually. Sophie forced a smile, trying to keep the growing suspicion in her chest under control. "I thought I'd surprise you with dinner," she said, her voice light but with a hint of tension. Mark smiled, but Sophie noticed he didn't seem as excited as he usually did. He wasn't his usual self. There was an emptiness in his eyes, and he seemed distracted. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but she pushed it aside. They sat down for dinner, but the conversation was strained. Mark wasn't engaged, and Sophie couldn't help but wonder if he was hiding something. That night, as they went to bed, Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that she was missing something. She had always trusted Mark, but now, a nagging voice inside her mind kept whispering that something wasn't right. She didn't want to believe it, but she couldn't ignore it. Her intuition was telling her that there was more to Mark's behavior than he was letting on. Unable to shake the feeling, Sophie decided to take a closer look. She had never been the type to snoop, but tonight she felt an overwhelming need for answers. She quietly picked up Mark's phone from the kitchen counter. He had left it there, unlocked and unattended. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she navigated through his messages. She wasn't proud of what she was about to do, but she needed to know the truth. As she scrolled through the messages, Sophie's worst fears were confirmed. There, in black and white, were text conversations between Mark and another woman, someone named Clara. The messages were flirty, full of inside jokes and plans to meet up. Sophie felt her heart break as she read their exchanges. They weren't just casual messages, they were intimate. She had been living in a lie, and Mark's betrayal was staring her in the face. The pain was overwhelming. Sophie's hands trembled as she read more, her mind struggling to process what was happening. How could he do this to her? How could the man she had trusted, the man she had given everything to, betray her like this? The tears began to flow, and the reality of the situation hit her like a ton of bricks. She had been lied to, deceived, and manipulated. Mark wasn't the person she thought he was. Sophie put the phone down, her heart shattered. She didn't know what to do next. Anger, sadness, and disbelief all swirled inside her. She wanted to confront him immediately, but something inside her told her to wait. She needed to think. She needed to plan her next move carefully. This wasn't just about finding out the truth, it was about taking back control of her life. Sophie knew one thing for sure. She wasn't going to let Mark's betrayal define her. She was stronger than that, and the way she would deal with this betrayal would leave him speechless. The next day, Sophie woke up feeling like a different person. The heartache was still fresh, but there was something inside her that had shifted. She had been betrayed, but she wasn't going to let this define her. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could control how she responded. She wasn't going to stay in the dark anymore, pretending everything was fine when her world had been shattered. Mark might have deceived her, but Sophie was done living in the shadows of his lies. She spent the morning in a haze, replaying everything in her mind. The dinner, the phone left behind, the casual way Mark had acted. How had she not seen the signs sooner? She thought she knew him better than anyone, but in that moment, she realized that she had been blind to the truth. The trust she had given him so freely had been ripped away without warning, and now she was left to pick up the pieces of her broken heart. Sophie couldn't just sit idly by and let this happen. She needed to confront Mark, but not in the way he expected. She wasn't going to beg for answers or beg for his forgiveness. She had already been the one to give everything to this relationship. Now it was time for her to take back control. She wasn't the same woman she had been before she found the messages, and she wasn't going to let his betrayal break her. If anything, it was going to make her stronger. Her mind raced with ideas. What could she do? How could she make him feel the weight of his actions? It wasn't about revenge, she told herself. It was about regaining her power, about showing him that she was not the woman who would be lied to and manipulated. She needed to reclaim her dignity, to show him that he couldn't walk all over her. Sophie wasn't just going to let this pass. She was going to make sure he understood the consequences of his actions. The opportunity came that evening. Mark came home, as he always did, acting as if nothing had changed. He didn't know that Sophie had seen the messages, that she had discovered everything. She stood in the kitchen, her back to him as he walked in. She could hear the sound of his footsteps behind her, the usual greeting on his lips. But this time, it was different. This time, she was the one who held the power. Sophie turned around slowly, meeting his eyes. Mark didn't notice the change in her demeanor at first. He smiled, expecting the usual routine. But Sophie wasn't smiling. She wasn't the same woman who had been waiting for him to come home. No, tonight, she was in control. "Mark," she said, her voice calm but cold. "We need to talk." He stopped in his tracks, sensing the shift in the air. There was no warmth in her tone, no hint of the love he had come to expect from her. Sophie's heart was racing, but she kept her composure. This wasn't going to be an emotional outburst. She wasn't going to beg him for answers. She was going to make him realize the consequences of what he had done. "About what?" Mark asked, his voice slightly hesitant now. Sophie could see the flicker of nervousness in his eyes. He knew something was coming, but he couldn't imagine what. "About the woman you've been seeing behind my back," she said flatly, her gaze unwavering. "Clara, was it?" Mark's face went pale. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. Sophie didn't give him a chance to speak. She wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. She had already seen the truth. "I saw the messages, Mark. I know everything," she continued, her voice steady. "The lies, the cheating, it's all there, in black and white. And you know what? I'm done. I'm done pretending I don't see it. I'm done pretending you're the man I thought you were." Mark stammered, looking around the room as if searching for the right words to salvage the situation. But there were no words that could undo what he had done. There were no apologies that could make up for the pain he had caused. Sophie wasn't interested in hearing his excuses. The time for explanations was over. "You thought you could get away with this, didn't you?" Sophie asked, her eyes narrowing. You thought I wouldn't find out. You thought I would just keep forgiving you. But I'm not that person anymore, Mark. Mark took a step toward her, but Sophie raised her hand, stopping him. She didn't need him to apologize. She didn't need him to beg for forgiveness. She needed him to understand that this was the end. I hope you're happy with what you've done, Sophie said, her voice shaking with emotion. Because I'm walking away from this, from you, from everything you promised me. I won't be your fool anymore. Mark's eyes filled with regret, but it was too late. Sophie turned away from him, walking out of the room and leaving him standing there, stunned and speechless. She had done it. She had taken back control of her life, and she wasn't going to let him or anyone else hurt her again. She was done with the lies. She was done with the betrayal. And as she stepped into the next chapter of her life, she knew one thing for sure. She would never let anyone have the power to break her again. After the confrontation, Sophie felt a strange mix of emotions: relief, anger, sadness, and empowerment. Walking away from Mark had been the hardest thing she had ever done, but it was also the most important. She could feel the weight of the betrayal lifting from her shoulders, but there was still a rawness in her heart. The memories of their relationship, of the love they had once shared, still lingered, but they no longer controlled her. She had made a choice to reclaim her power, and that choice had set her free. The next few days were difficult. She spent most of her time in solitude, processing the emotions that had been building up inside her for months. It wasn't just about Mark and his betrayal. It was about the trust she had given so freely, only for it to be shattered in the worst way possible. Sophie found herself questioning everything: the foundation of their relationship, the promises made, the life they had planned together, the life she thought they would have. But as the days went on, something shifted. She stopped seeing herself as a victim of Mark's betrayal. She wasn't the woman who had been hurt and broken. She was the woman who had walked away. She was the woman who had taken control of her life, who had chosen herself over the lies and deception. And that realization brought her a sense of peace. One afternoon, Sophie decided to take a walk through the park near her apartment. The crisp autumn air felt refreshing, and the beauty of the changing leaves reminded her that life was still full of new beginnings. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't without its challenges, but Sophie was learning to embrace her independence. She didn't need Mark or anyone else to validate her worth. She was enough on her own. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a text from a friend asking how she was doing. Sophie smiled, grateful for the support of her friends. They had been her rock through the toughest time in her life. The simple text made her realize just how much love and support she had around her. She wasn't alone in this. She had people who cared about her, who would help her through the hard days, and who would celebrate her victories with her. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of emotions and self-reflection. Sophie began to pour herself into her career, something she had neglected during her relationship with Mark. She had always been ambitious, driven, and passionate about her work, but for the longest time, she had put her personal dreams on the back burner in favor of their relationship. Now, she was rediscovering her purpose. She was back in control, and it felt good. Her colleagues at work noticed a change in her. She was more confident, more focused, and more determined than ever before. Sophie had always been good at what she did, but now she was thriving. The promotion she had been hoping for came through, and with it came a renewed sense of self-worth. She realized that her value didn't depend on anyone else's actions. Her worth was intrinsic, and she was more than capable of achieving her goals on her own. One evening, as she stood in front of the mirror, getting ready for a night out with friends, Sophie took a deep breath and looked at herself. The woman who stared back at her wasn't the same one who had walked away from Mark. She had changed. She had grown stronger, braver, and more independent. She had faced the worst kind of betrayal and had come out on the other side, not broken, but empowered. Sophie had learned that the only approval she needed was her own. That night, as she laughed and danced with her friends, Sophie felt a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. The hurt from the past was still there, but it no longer held the same power over her. She had let go of the anger, the sadness, and the bitterness. She had chosen to rise above it all, to embrace the new chapter of her life, and to believe in her own worth. As the night came to a close, Sophie felt a deep sense of gratitude. She was thankful for the lessons she had learned, for the strength she had found within herself, and for the people who had stood by her. She wasn't defined by the betrayal she had endured. She was defined by the woman she had become, a woman who had faced adversity and emerged stronger than ever before. And as Sophie looked forward to the future, she knew that whatever came next, she was ready. She was no longer the woman who was afraid to walk away. She was the woman who had chosen herself, who had taken back her power, and who was now free to live her life on her own terms. As Sophie continued her journey of self-discovery and healing, she began to feel a new sense of purpose and clarity. Her life, once dominated by Mark's presence and their shared plans, was now hers to shape and define. She had learned that life didn't have to revolve around someone else's choices. It could revolve around her own. With each passing day, Sophie realized just how much she had sacrificed in the past and how much more she had to offer to the world. Her career flourished. Sophie poured herself into her work, achieving goals she had once only dreamed of. Her confidence grew as she took on new projects and proved herself to her colleagues. She no longer felt the weight of Mark's disapproval or the guilt of putting his needs first. She was no longer seeking validation from anyone. She was the architect of her own success, and that sense of control was empowering. She also made time for things she had always loved but had put aside. Sophie began taking weekend trips to new places, solo adventures that allowed her to rediscover her sense of independence. She had always wanted to travel, but for years she had been waiting for the right partner to share the experience with. Now she was creating her own adventures, and they were more fulfilling than she had imagined. One Saturday, Sophie took a trip to the mountains. The scenery was breathtaking. Tall, majestic trees, wide open spaces, and the scent of pine filling the air. As she sat on a rock overlooking a tranquil lake, Sophie felt a deep sense of peace. It wasn't the peace she had been searching for in a relationship. It wasn't the kind of peace that came from another person. This was a peace that came from within, from knowing that she was enough on her own, that she didn't need anyone to complete her. On the hike back down, she met a fellow traveler who was also on her own adventure. They struck up a conversation, and as they talked about their journeys and experiences, Sophie realized something important. She was no longer afraid of being alone. In fact, she had learned to love it. She had spent so much of her life seeking love from someone else, waiting for the perfect relationship to complete her. Now she understood that the most important relationship she would ever have was with herself. As Sophie returned home from her trip, she felt lighter, more confident, and more grounded. She was no longer carrying the emotional weight of the past. She had healed, but more than that, she had thrived. The woman who had been betrayed was no longer there. Instead, there was a woman who had reclaimed her life, her freedom, and her self-worth. She was in control, and she wasn't going to let anyone, especially Mark, take that away from her. One evening, Sophie received a message from Mark. It was a simple text, asking if they could talk. The familiar emotions stirred inside her as she read the message, but this time, it was different. She didn't feel the urge to run back to him, to hear him apologize and beg for forgiveness. She didn't feel the need to reopen that chapter of her life. Instead, she felt a sense of clarity. She had moved on. The person she was now was stronger, wiser, and no longer the woman who would let herself be disrespected. Still, Sophie knew that closure was important. She wanted to face Mark one last time, not for him, but for herself. She wanted to show him that she had healed, that she had become someone new, someone who no longer needed him in her life. So she agreed to meet him for a final conversation. When they met, Sophie saw the remorse in his eyes. He apologized for everything: his infidelity, the lies, the hurt he had caused. He told her he had made a mistake and wished he could go back. But Sophie wasn't interested in his apologies anymore. She wasn't seeking closure from him. She had already closed the door on their relationship. She had already forgiven herself for staying as long as she did, for giving him more chances than he deserved. "I'm not the same person I was when we were together," Sophie said, her voice steady but firm. "And I'm not the person you hurt anymore. I've moved on, Mark, and I need you to understand that." Mark seemed to realize in that moment that Sophie had truly let go. She wasn't looking for revenge or validation. She was simply reclaiming her life. "I'm glad you're okay," he said quietly. "I really am." Sophie nodded, giving him a final smile. "Goodbye, Mark." As she walked away, Sophie felt a sense of finality. She wasn't carrying the weight of the past anymore. She wasn't letting it haunt her or control her. She had taken back her life, and now she was ready to embrace the future with open arms. As Sophie stepped away from Mark and closed the door to that chapter of her life, she felt a profound sense of liberation. She had spent so many months, even years, waiting for the love and respect she deserved, and now she was finally in control of her own life. No more second-guessing herself. No more compromising her happiness for someone else's mistakes. She was whole on her own. Over the next few months, Sophie's transformation was nothing short of remarkable. She had always been strong, but now she was stronger than ever. The emotional scars from Mark's betrayal no longer had a hold on her. Instead of being a victim of her circumstances, she had embraced her healing journey and used it as a catalyst for growth. Sophie began focusing more on her passions. She had always loved photography, but it was something she had let slide over the years. Now, with time to herself, she picked up her camera again and started capturing moments of beauty and joy. Whether it was a simple sunset, the smile of a child, or a candid shot of someone she loved, Sophie found a sense of fulfillment in her photography that she hadn't known in years. It became not just a hobby, but a form of therapy, a way to express her emotions and see the world through a lens of positivity and hope. Her work life also flourished. Sophie's career had always been important to her, but she had put her personal dreams on hold for far too long. Now, with her newfound confidence, she took on more leadership roles and started pushing boundaries she hadn't dared to before. Her colleagues noticed the change in her as well. She was not just a hard-working employee anymore. She was a force to be reckoned with, someone who owned her worth and wasn't afraid to speak up for what she deserved. Though Sophie was enjoying her life more than she ever had, there were still moments when loneliness crept in. There were nights when she would sit in her apartment, quietly reflecting on her journey, wondering if she would ever find love again. But even in those moments of doubt, Sophie understood that love wasn't something she needed to chase. She had already found love, self-love, and that, she realized, was far more valuable than any relationship she had ever been in. One evening, after a successful art show where she had displayed her photography for the first time, Sophie sat with a glass of wine, gazing out at the city lights. It had been a long, challenging journey, but she was proud of how far she had come. She wasn't the same person who had been heartbroken and lost. She was a woman who had found herself again, and that made all the difference. It was then that Sophie received a message. It was from a number she didn't recognize. Curiously, she opened it, and as she read the message, her heart skipped a beat. It was a simple message, but it struck her deeply. I know this might sound strange, but I just wanted to tell you how much I admire your strength. I've watched you from afar, and the way you've handled everything, your grace, your independence, it's truly inspiring. You've become someone I truly respect. At first, Sophie felt a rush of emotions. This wasn't from Mark. It wasn't from anyone she had ever expected. The message was from someone she had met at her art show, a fellow photographer who had been in the same industry for years. They had talked briefly about their work and exchanged a few thoughts on their craft. It was a simple, professional conversation, but this message was different. It was genuine, thoughtful, and unexpected. As Sophie read it over again, a soft smile spread across her face. For the first time in a while, she realized that the most important thing was not seeking validation from anyone else. Not from Mark, not from anyone. She had already validated herself. She had found her own worth, her own strength, and that was the most fulfilling feeling of all. The respect from others was a bonus, but it no longer defined her happiness. In that moment, Sophie decided that she was ready to open her heart again, not to anyone in particular, but to the possibilities that life had to offer. She didn't need a relationship to feel whole. She knew she was enough, just as she was. But maybe, just maybe, there was a love out there that could complement the life she had already built for herself. Sophie closed her phone and took a deep breath. She wasn't looking for revenge anymore. She wasn't looking for answers from the past. She had healed, she had grown, and now she was simply ready for the next chapter. Whatever came next, she knew she would face it with the same strength, courage, and independence that had carried her through the hardest times. And for the first time in a long time, she was at peace with herself, knowing that the best was yet to come. True strength comes from within. When life throws its hardest challenges your way, it's up to you to decide how you rise from it. No betrayal or heartbreak can take away the power you have over your own life. Embrace your worth, choose yourself, and remember that the love you seek must first come from within. Have you ever faced betrayal? How did you reclaim your power and move forward? Share your story in the comments below. Let's support each other through this journey of self-love and healing. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more empowering stories. You're stronger than you think, and together we rise.